Thanks very much, Louise, and thank you very much everyone who came along this afternoon to listen to all these terrible acronyms. I'm afraid I've got another one for you, PACER Plus. And PACER Plus is quite a different trade agreement to the other ones that we've been talking about, but I think it has some really important issues that we need to be aware about, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. So I'm Dr Deborah Gleeson from La Trobe University, and before I start I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. So PACER Plus is a regional trade agreement that's been under negotiation since 2009 between the member states of the Pacific Islands Forum. Like the other trade agreements that we've been talking about, there are big socio-economic differences between the participants in PACER Plus. Australia and New Zealand are the only high-income countries that are involved, and the rest are developing countries, including some very small island developing states. The negotiations have been highly controversial. This is why they've dragged on for so long. And recently, Papua New Guinea and Fiji, the two biggest economies apart from Australia and New Zealand, have withdrawn from the negotiations and are not expected to sign the agreement. However, Australia and New Zealand are very keen for the other Pacific Island countries to come on board and are pushing quite hard for conclusion of this agreement in 2017. Not sure why that's not going to the next slide. Okay, here we are. So most of the Pacific Island countries, in contrast to a lot of other countries, have little to gain from trade agreements because they've got few goods and services to trade. There are few economies of scale and they're mostly geographically very distant from major markets. 8 of the countries involved are not yet members of the World Trade Organization, so they haven't even yet met the sort of basic standards that most other countries have met in terms of trade in goods and services. And yet here they are entering into a trade agreement where they'll be expected to meet much higher standards, as all free trade agreements, bilateral and regional free trade agreements do. Many of them have very small economies and are heavily reliant on foreign aid and remittances. And tariffs, taxes on imports, particularly on goods, are a really important source of revenue in many of these countries. They also have some of the highest rates of non-communicable diseases in the world and health systems that struggle to deal with them. Many of these countries, for example, need to evacuate patients for conditions like dialysis. Leaked negotiating texts show that PACER Plus includes chapters on trade in services and the movement of workers from one country to another. Health services and health workers are not automatically covered by this agreement, but countries can list their health services and their health workers as being covered, and we don't know how many countries have done that. If the Pacific Island countries liberalise their health services, this could lead to the proliferation of high-cost private services and the further erosion of equity and access in these countries. Liberalisation of health services, as David Legg mentioned before, can also stimulate medical tourism, which carries the risks of diverting scarce resources from public services to service wealthy patients from other countries. Liberalising the movement of health workers can exacerbate existing health worker shortages, which are really critical in some areas in the Pacific Islands. Removing or reducing tariffs on goods, which is a central plank of trade agreements, could have a significant impact on the revenue of the Pacific Island countries. And there's quite a substantial body of evidence, some of which I think you've already heard about today, and you'll hear about some more, that reducing tariffs on food products can lead to lower prices for unhealthy foods and can also affect household food security. PACER Plus also includes a chapter on technical barriers to trade that requires countries to comply with WTO rules to the extent that they can. This is even for countries that aren't members of the WTO. So when they design regulations and technical standards, things like nutrition labelling, for example, they need to meet certain requirements around providing evidence to support those regulations. or they need to base them on international standards, which can often be sort of the lowest common denominator. PACER Plus doesn't include an investor-state dispute settlement process like you've heard Ron talk about in the TPP and CETA, for example, but it does include a process where foreign companies can raise disputes in the local courts in the Pacific Island countries over what they perceive as breaches to the agreement. So they do have extra rights, extra legal rights over the domestic companies. Added to all of these issues is the burden of compliance with this trade agreement that the small Pacific Island countries will experience, where public resources need to be diverted to a lot of compliance responsibilities. And there's very limited special and differential treatment even for the poorest countries in the group. Added to this, the Pacific Island countries will also have very limited input into the governance and implementation of the agreement. The governance structures are very heavily dominated by Australia and New Zealand. So in conclusion, depending on the commitments that the Pacific Island countries make, there seem to be some significant health risks in this agreement that possibly outweigh any economic benefits for the Pacific Island countries. And I'll be talking in a bit more detail about these issues in a session on Wednesday afternoon if anyone's particularly interested in the Pacific Island countries and what the issues are for them. Thank you very much.